Chapter 65. A retrospective link, necessary for the concatenation of these memoirs. Indulge me with a patient hearing, proceeded the Hungarian, and all these riddles soon will be explained. Inflamed with the desire of seeing foreign countries, I disobeyed the will of an indulgent father, from whose house, withdrawing privately, I set out for Italy in disguise by the way of Tyrol, visited Venice, Rome, Florence, and embarking at Naples in an English ship, arrived at St. Lucar, from whence I repaired to Seville. There, in a few days, was my curiosity engaged by the fame of the fair Seraphina, who was justly deemed the most accomplished beauty in that part of Spain. Nay, blush not, gentle creature, for by my hopes of heaven, thy charms were even injured by the cold applause of that report. Nevertheless, I was warmly interested by the uncommon character, and eagerly longed to see this pattern of perfection. As Don Diego did not train her up in that restraint to which the Spanish ladies are subjected, I soon found an opportunity of seeing her at church. And no person here present will, I presume, doubt, but that I was instantly captivated by her beauty and deportment. Had I thought that Don Diego's favor was unengaged, perhaps I should have followed the dictates of vanity and inexperience, and presented myself in my own character, among the crowd of her professed admirers. I knew her father had been an officer of distinguished rank and reputation, and did not doubt that he would have regarded a young soldier of unexceptionable pedigree, and, I will even add, of untainted fame. Nor did I suppose my own father could have objected against such an advantageous match. But by dint of industrious inquiry, I learned that the divine Seraphina was already betrothed to Don Manuel de Mendoza, and this information overwhelmed me with despair. After having revolved 1,000 projects for retarding and preventing that detested union, I resolved to avail myself of my talent for drawing, and professed myself a master of that science, in hope of being employed by the father of Seraphina, who, I knew, let slip no opportunity of improving his daughter's education. Accordingly, I had the good fortune to attract his notice, was invited to his house, honored with his approbation, and furnished with unrestricted opportunities of conversing with the dear object of my love. The passion which her beauty had kindled was by the perfections of her mind inflamed to such a degree of transport as could not be concealed from her penetration. She chanced to relish my conversation. I gradually acquired her friendship. Pity was the next passion that she entertained in my favor. I then ventured to disclose myself, and the dear charmer did not disapprove of my presumption. She and her mother had been perplexed with some religious scruples, concerning which they appealed to my opinion, and I was happy enough to set their minds at ease. This sort of intercourse naturally created a mutual confidence among us, and, in a word, I was blessed with the daughter's love and mother's approbation. Don Diego will pardon these clandestine measures, which we took, from a full persuasion that it was impossible to render him propitious to the views in which our hearts and hands were so deeply interested. I did not then know how little he was addicted to superstition. Without entering into a detail of the schemes we projected to delay the happiness of Mendoza, I shall only observe that, knowing the fatal day was at length unalterably fixed, we determined to elude the purpose of Don Diego by flight, and everything was actually prepared for our escape. When the hour of appointment arrived, I repaired to the place at which I had proposed to enter the house, and stumbled, in the dark, over the body of a man still warm and bleeding. Alarmed at this occurrence, I darted myself through the window, and rushing to the apartment of the ladies, immortal powers, beheld the peerless Seraphina and her virtuous mother stretched on a couch and, in all appearance, deprived of life. The company will easily conceive what agonies I felt at such a spectacle. I ran towards the spot in a transport of horror. I clasped my lovely mistress in my arms, and, finding her still breathing, endeavored, but in vain, to wake her from the trance. Antonia was overwhelmed with the same lethargic power. My fancy was immediately struck with the apprehension of their being poisoned. Regardless of my own situation, I alarmed the family, called for assistance, and requested the servants to summon Don Diego to the dismal scene. I was informed that their master had rode forth in manifest confusion, and while I pondered on this surprising excursion, an apothecary in the neighborhood entered the chamber, and having examined the pulses of the ladies, declared that their lives were in no danger, and advised that they should be undressed and conveyed to bed. While their women were busied in this employment, I went into the courtyard, attended by some of the servants with lights, in order to view the body of the man which I had found at my arrival. His apparel was mean, his countenance ferocious. A long spada was buckled to his thigh, and in his belt were stuck a brace of loaded pistols, so that we concluded he was some thief who had waited for an opportunity and, seeing the casement open, intended to rob the house but was prevented and slain by Don Diego himself, whose retreat, however, did not a little confound our conjecture. For my own part, I remained all night in the house, tortured with fear, vexation, and suspense. My hope was altogether disappointed by this unhappy accident, and I shuddered at the prospect of losing Serafina forever, either by this mysterious malady or by her marriage with Mendoza, which I now despaired of being able to defeat. The majordomo, having waited several hours for his lord's return without seeing him appear, thought proper to dispatch a messenger to Don Manuel with an account of what had happened, and that nobleman, arriving in the morning, took possession of the house. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Serafina began to stir, and at 5 she and her mother were perfectly awake. They no sooner recovered the use of reflection than they gave signs of equal sorrow and amazement, and earnestly called for Isabella, who was privy to our design, and who, after a very minute inquiry, was found in a lone and solitary chamber, where she had been confined. Such was the confusion of the house, that no person ever dreamed of asking how I entered, each domestic, in all probability, supposing I had been introduced by his fellow, so that I tarried unquestioned, on pretense of concern for the distress of a family in which I had been so generously entertained, and, by Isabella, sent my respects and duty to her ladies. She was, therefore, not a little surprised, when, after every other servant had withdrawn, she heard the lovely Serafina exclaim, with all the violence of grief, "Ah, Isabella, Orlando is no more." But their astonishment was still greater when she assured them of my being alive and in the house. They recounted to her the adventure of last night, which she explained by informing them of the letters which Don Diego had intercepted. And they immediately concluded that he had, in the precipitation of his wrath, killed, by mistake, the person who was found dead in the courtyard. This conjecture alarmed them on my account. They, by the medium of Isabella, conjured me to leave the house, lest Don Diego should return and accomplish his resentment, and I was persuaded to withdraw, after I had settled the channel of a correspondence with the confidant. Being now obliged to alter our measures, because our former intention was discovered by Don Diego, I secured a retreat for Serafina and her mother at the house of the English consul in Seville, who was my particular friend. And next day, understanding from Isabella that her lord had not yet reappeared, and that Don Manuel was very urgent in his addresses, we concerted an assignation in the garden, and that same evening I was fortunate enough to convey my prize to the asylum I had prepared for their reception. Inexpressible was the rage of Mendoza when he heard of their elopement. He raved like one deprived of reason, swore he would put all the servants of the family to the rack, and, in consequence of the intelligence he obtained by threats and promises, set on foot a very strict inquiry, in order to apprehend the fugitives and Orlando, who had by some means or other incurred his suspicion. We eluded his search by the vigilance and caution of our kind host, and, while we remained in concealment, were extremely astonished to hear that the unfortunate Don Diego was proclaimed a traitor, and a price set upon his head. This information overwhelmed us all with the utmost affliction. Antonia lamented, without ceasing, the disgrace of her beloved lord, from whom she never would have withdrawn herself, but with the lively hope of a reconciliation, after the first transports of his ire should have subsided, and the real character of Orlando should have appeared. It was not long before we had reason to believe that Mendoza was the accuser of Don Diego. Nay, start not, Signor. Manuel was actually that traitor. This was the turn of his revenge. When he found himself disappointed in the hope of possessing the incomparable Serafina, he took a base advantage of your absence and retreat. He posted to Madrid, impeached you to the Secretary of State of having maintained a criminal correspondence with the enemies of Spain, included me in his accusation as a spy for the House of Austria, and framed such a plausible tale, from the circumstances of your distress, that Don Diego was outlawed, and Mendoza gratified with a grant of his estate. These melancholy incidents made a deep impression upon the mind of the virtuous Antonia, who, waiving every other consideration, would have personally appeared for the vindication of her husband's honor, had not we dissuaded her from such a rash undertaking, by demonstrating her inability to contend with such a powerful antagonist, and representing that her appearance would be infallibly attended with the ruin of Seraphina, who would certainly fall into the hands of the villain to whom she had been contracted. We exhorted her to wait patiently for some happy revolution of fortune, and encouraged her with the hope of Don Diego's exerting himself effectually in his own defense. Meanwhile, our worthy landlord was suddenly cut off by death, and his widow being resolved to retire into her own country, we secretly embarked in the same ship, and arrived in England about 18 months ago. Antonia still continued to pine over the ruin of her house. As she could hear no tidings of Don Diego, she concluded he was dead, and mourned with unabating sorrow. In vain I assured her that, soon as my own affairs should be adjusted, I would exert my whole endeavors to find and succor him. She could not imagine that a man of his spirit and disposition would live so long in obscurity, and her affliction derived new force from the death of the consul's widow, with whom she had lived in the most unbounded intimacy and friendship. From that day, her health evidently declined. She foresaw her dissolution, and comforted herself with the hope of seeing her husband and her friend in a place where no treachery is felt, and no sorrow is known. Confident of my integrity, and the purity of my love, she, in the most pathetic terms, recommended Seraphina to my care. Ha, weepest thou, fair excellence, at the remembrance of that tender scene, when the good Antonia, on the bed of death, joined thy soft hand to mine and said, "Rinaldo, I bequeath this orphan to your love. It is a sacred pledge which, if you cherish with due honor and regard, internal peace and happiness will ever smile within your bosom. But if you treat it with indifference, dishonor, or neglect, just heaven will punish your breach of trust with everlasting disappointments and disquiet. Signor Don Diego, I see you are moved, and therefore will not dwell on such distressful circumstances. The excellent Antonia exchanged this life for a more happy state, and so exquisite was the sorrow of the tender-hearted Seraphina as to torture me with the apprehension that she would not long survive her pious mother. How I obeyed the injunctions of that departing saint, Monimia, for that name she now assumed, can testify, until that artful serpent Fathom glided into our mutual confidence, abused our ears, poisoned our unsuspected faith, and effected that fatal breach, productive of all the misery and vexation which we have suffered, and which is now so happily expelled. Heaven, said the Castilian, hath visited me for the sins and errors of my youth, yet such mercy hath been mingled with its chastisements, I dare not murmur or repine. The tears of penitence and sorrow shall water my Antonia's grave. As for Mendoza, I rejoice at his treachery, by which the obligation of my promise is cancelled, and my honor fully acquitted. He shall not triumph in his guilt. My services, my character, and innocence shall soon confront his perfidy, and, I hope, defeat his interest. The king is just and gracious, nor is my family and name unknown. Here the Jew interposing, presented to him a letter from a person of consequence at Madrid, whom Joshua had interested in the cause of Don Diego. That nobleman had already found means to represent the case of Zelos to his majesty, who had actually ordered Don Manuel to be confined, until the injured person should appear to justify himself, and prosecute his accuser according to the terms of law. At the same time, Don Diego was summoned to present himself before the king within a limited time, to answer to the charge which Mendoza had brought against him. The Spaniard's heart overflowed with gratitude and joy when he read this intimation. He embraced the Jew, who, before Zelos could give utterance to his thoughts, told him that the Spanish ambassador at London, having been prepossessed in his favor, craved the honor of seeing Don Diego, and that he, Joshua, was ready to conduct him to the house. Then is my heart at rest, cried the Castilian. The house of Zelos once more shall lift up its head. I shall again revisit my native country with honor, and abase the villain who hath soiled my fame. O my children, this day is replete with such joy and satisfaction, as I did not think had been in the power of heaven to grant, without the interposition of a miracle. To you, Rinaldo, to you, illustrious lady, and to these worthy gentlemen, am I indebted for the restoration of that for which alone I wish to live. And when my heart ceases to retain the obligation, may I forfeit the name of a Castilian, and scorn and dishonor be my portion. Perhaps all Europe could not produce another company so happy as that which now sat down to dinner in the house of Madame Clement, whose own benevolent heart was peculiarly adapted for such enjoyment. The lovers feasted their eyes more than their appetite by a tender intercourse of glances, which needed not the slow interpretation of speech, while the Spaniard regarded them alternately with looks of wonder and paternal joy, and every individual surveyed the all-deserving pair with admiration and esteem. Seraphina taking the advantage of this general satisfaction, when the heart, softened into complacency, deposits every violent thought. "I must now," said she, "try my interest with Rinaldo. The good company shall bear witness to my triumph or repulse. I do not ask you to forgive, but to withhold your vengeance from the wretched Fathom. His fraud, ingratitude, and villainy are, I believe, unrivaled. Yet his base designs have been defeated, and heaven perhaps hath made him the involuntary instrument for bringing our constancy and virtue to the test. Besides, his perfidy is already punished with the last degree of human misery and disgrace. The doctor, who has traced him in all his conduct and vicissitudes of fortune, will draw a picture of his present wretchedness, which, I doubt not, will move your compassion, as it hath already excited mine." The generous hostess was ready to enforce this charitable proposal with all her eloquence, when Melville, with a look that well expressed his magnanimity of love, replied, "Such a boon becomes the gentle Seraphina, O. Every moment furnishes me with fresh matter to admire the virtues of thy soul. If thou, whose tender heart hath been so rent with misery and anguish, canst intercede for thy tormentor, who now suffers in his turn, shall I refuse to pardon the miserable wretch? No, let me glory in imitating the great example, and solicit Don Diego in behalf of the same miscreant whose perfidious barbarity cost him such intolerable woe." "Enough," cried the Castilian. "I have disclaimed the vindictive principles of a Spaniard, and leave the miserable object to the sting of his own conscience, which, soon or late, will not fail to avenge the wrongs we have sustained from his deceit." Chapter 66. The history draws near a period. Universal was the applause which they acquired by this noble sacrifice of their resentment. The afternoon was spent in the utmost harmony and good humor, and at the earnest solicitation of Rinaldo, whose fancy still harbored the apprehensions of another separation, Don Diego consented that the indissoluble knot should be tied between that young gentleman and Seraphina in 2 days, and the place appointed for the ceremony was the very church where they had been restored to the arms of each other. The lovely bride, with a silent blush that set her lover's heart on fire, submitted to this determination, in consequence of which the company was bespoke for that auspicious hour, and the evening being pretty far advanced, they took leave of the ladies and retired to their respective homes. Don Diego and his future son-in-law being reconducted to their lodgings, in the coach of the Jew, who, taking an opportunity of being alone with Melville, observed that it would be necessary on this occasion to supply the Castilian with a sum of money, in order to support his dignity and independence, in furnishing Seraphina with everything suitable to her rank and merit, and that he would willingly accommodate him, provided he knew how to propose it so as to give no offense to his punctilious disposition. Rinaldo, thanking him for this generous anticipation, advised him to solicit the Spaniard's correspondence in the way of business, and to put the whole on the footing of his own interest, by which means Don Diego's delicacy could sustain no affront. Fraught with this instruction, the Israelite desired a private audience of the Castilian in which, after an apology for the freedom of his demand, "Signor Don Diego," said he, "as your fortune hath been so long embezzled by your adversary in Spain, and your correspondence with that country entirely cut off, it is not to be supposed that your finances are at present in such a condition as to maintain the splendor of your family. Count de Melville's whole fortune is at your command, and had not he been afraid of giving umbrage to the peculiar delicacy of your sentiments, he would have pressed you to use it for your convenience. For my own part, over and above the inclination I have to serve Don Diego, I consult my own private advantage in desiring you to accept my service on this occasion. Money is the chief commodity in which I deal, and, if you honor me with your commands, I shall be a gainer by my obedience." Don Diego replied, with a smile that denoted how well he understood the meaning of this address, "Surely, Signor, I am bound by the strongest ties to exert my utmost endeavors for your advantage, and I pray God this your proposal may have that issue. I am well acquainted with the Count's generosity and refined notions of honor, and too much obliged by him already to hesitate with punctilious reserve in accepting his future assistance. Nevertheless, since you have contrived a scheme for removing all scruples of that sort, I shall execute it with pleasure and, in the form of business, you shall have all the security I can give for what shall be necessary to answer my present occasions." The preliminaries being thus settled, Joshua advanced for his use £1,000, for which he would take neither bond, note, nor receipt, desiring only that the Castilian would mark it in his own pocketbook, that the debt might appear, in case any accident should befall the borrower. Although the Spaniard had been accustomed to the uncommon generosity of Melville, he could not help wondering at this nobleness of behavior, so little to be expected from any merchant, much less from a Jewish broker. While this affair was on the anvil, Rinaldo, who could no longer withhold the communication of his happiness from his sister and relations in Germany, took up the pen, and, in a letter to his brother-in-law, recounted all the circumstances of the surprising turn of fate which he had experienced since his arrival in England. He likewise related the story of Don Diego, informed them of the day appointed for his nuptials, and entreated the major to make a journey to London with his wife, or, if that should be impracticable, to come as far as Brussels, where they should be met by him and his Seraphina. There was now but one day between him and the accomplishment of his dearest wish, and that was spent in procuring a license and adjusting the preparations for the grand festival. Don Diego in the forenoon visited Madame Clement, to whom he repeated his warm acknowledgments of her bounty and maternal affection to his daughter, and presented to Seraphina banknotes to the amount of £500 to defray the necessary expense for her wedding ornaments. All the previous steps being taken for the solemnization of this interesting event, and the hour of appointment arrived, the bridegroom, accompanied by his father-in-law, hastened to the place of rendezvous, which was the vestry-room of the church we have already described, where they were received by the good clergyman in his canonicals. And here they had not waited many minutes, when they were joined by Madame Clement and the amiable bride, escorted by the friendly physician, who had all along borne such a share in their concerns. Seraphina was dressed in a sack of white satin, and the ornaments of her head were adjusted in the Spanish fashion, which gave a peculiar air to her appearance, and an additional spirit to those attractions which engaged the heart of each beholder. There was nothing remarkable in the habit of Rinaldo, who had copied the plainness and elegance of his mistress. But when she entered the place, his features were animated with a double proportion of vivacity, and their eyes meeting, seemed to kindle a blaze which diffused warmth and joy through the countenances of all present. After a short pause, her father led her to the altar, and gave her away to the transported Rinaldo before the priest who performed the ceremony, and bestowed the nuptial benediction on this enraptured pair. The sanction of the church being thus obtained, they withdrew into the vestry, where Melville sealed his title on her rosy lips, and presented his wife to the company, who embraced her in their turns, with fervent wishes for their mutual happiness. Though the scene of this transaction was remote from any inhabited neighborhood, the church was surrounded by a crowd of people, who, with uncommon demonstration of surprise and admiration, petitioned heaven to bless so fair a couple. Such indeed was their eagerness to see them, that some lives were endangered by the pressure of the crowd, which attended them with loud acclamations to the coach. After the bridegroom had deposited in the hands of the minister £100 for the benefit of the poor of that parish, and thrown several handfuls of money among the multitude, Seraphina re-embarked in Madame Clement's convenience, with that good lady and Don Diego, while Rinaldo, with the clergyman and doctor, followed in Joshua's coach to a pleasant country house upon the Thames, at a distance of a few miles from London. This the Jew had borrowed from the owner for a few days, and there they were received by that honest Hebrew, who had provided a very elegant entertainment for the occasion. He had also bespoke a small but excellent band of music, which regaled their ears while they sat at dinner. And the afternoon being calm and serene, he prevailed on them to take the air on the river, in a barge which he had prepared for the purpose. But notwithstanding this diversity of amusement, Rinaldo would have found it the longest day he had ever passed, had not his imagination been diverted by an incident which employed his attention during the remaining part of the evening. They had drunk tea, and engaged in a party at whist, when they were surprised with a noise of contention from a public-house that fronted the windows of the apartment in which they sat. Alarmed at this uproar, they forsook their cards and, throwing up the casement, beheld a hearse surrounded by 4 men on horseback, who had stopped the carriage and violently pulled the driver from his seat. This uncommon arrest had engaged the curiosity of the publican's family, who stood at the door to observe the consequence, when all of a sudden appeared a person in canonicals, well mounted, who, riding up to those who maltreated the driver, bestowed upon one of them such a blow with the butt end of his whip as laid him sprawling on the ground, and, springing from his saddle upon the box, took the reins into his own hand, swearing with great vehemence that he would murder every man who should attempt to obstruct the hearse. The good priest who had married Rinaldo was not a little scandalized at this ferocious behavior in a clergyman, and could not help saying aloud, he was a disgrace to the cloth, when the horseman, looking up to the window, replied, "Sir, may I be D? And, if any man in England has a greater respect for the cloth than I have. But at present I am quite distracted." So saying, he whipped up the horses, and had actually disentangled the hearse from those who surrounded it, when he was opposed by another troop, one of whom alighted with great expedition, and cut the harness so as that he could not possibly proceed. Finding himself thus driven to bay, he leaped upon the ground, and exercised his weapon with such amazing strength and agility, that several of his antagonists were left motionless on the field, before he was overpowered and disarmed by dint of numbers, who assailed him on all sides. The mad parson being thus taken prisoner, an elderly person of a very prepossessing appearance went up to the hearse, and, unbolting the door, a young lady sprung out and, shrieking, ran directly to the public-house, to the infinite astonishment and affright of the whole family, who believed it was the spirit of the deceased person, whose body lay in the carriage. Rinaldo, who was with difficulty restrained from interposing in behalf of the clergyman against such odds, no sooner perceived this apparition than, supposing her to be some distressed damsel, his quixotism awoke. He descended in an instant, and rushed into the house, among those that pursued the fair phantom. Don Diego and the physician took the same road, while the real clergyman and Joshua tarried with the ladies, who were, by this time, very much interested in the event. Melville found the young lady in the hands of the old gentleman, who had released her from the hearse, and who now bitterly upbraided her for her folly and disobedience, while she protested with great vivacity that whatever she might suffer from his severity, she would never submit to the hateful match he had proposed, nor break the promise she had already made to the gentleman who now attempted to rescue her from the tyranny of a cruel father. This declaration was followed by a plentiful shower of tears, which the father could not behold with unmoistened eyes, although he reviled her with marks of uncommon displeasure. And turning to the Count, "I appeal to you, sir," said he, "whether I have not reason to curse the undutiful obstinacy of that pert baggage, and renounce her for ever as an alien to my blood. She has for some months been solicited in marriage by an honest citizen, a £30,000 man, and instead of listening to such an advantageous proposal, she hath bestowed her heart upon a young fellow not worth a groat. Ah, you degenerate hussy, this comes of your plays and romances. If thy mother were not a woman of an unexceptionable life and conversation, I should verily believe thou art no child of mine. Run away with a beggar. For shame. I suppose, replied Rinaldo, the person to whom your daughter's affection inclines is that clergyman who exerted himself so manfully at the door. Clergyman, cried the other, adad, he has more of the devil than the church about him. A ruffian, he has, for aught I know, murdered the worthy gentleman whom I intended for my son-in-law, and the rogue, if I had not kept out of his way, would, I suppose, have served me with the same sauce. Me, who have been his master for many years, and had resolved to make a man of him. Sir, he was my own clerk, and this is the return I have met with from the serpent which I cherished in my bosom. Here he was interrupted by the arrival of the citizen for whom he had expressed such concern. That gentleman had received a contusion upon one eye, by which the sight was altogether obstructed, so that he concluded he should never retrieve the use of that organ, and with great clamor took all the spectators to witness the injury he had sustained. He entered the room with manifest perturbation, demanded satisfaction of the father, and peremptorily declared it should not be a lost eye to him if there was law in England. This unseasonable demand, and the boisterous manner in which it was made, did not at all suit the present humor of the old gentleman, who told him peevishly he owed him no eye, and bade him go and ask reparation of the person who had done him wrong. The young lady, snatching this favorable occasion, earnestly entreated Melville and his company to intercede with her father in behalf of her lover, who, she assured them, was a young gentleman of a good family and uncommon merit. And in compliance with her request, they invited him and his daughter to the house in which they lodged, where they would be disencumbered of the crowd which this dispute had gathered together, and more at leisure to consult about the measures necessary to be taken. The old gentleman thanked them for their courtesy, which he did not think proper to refuse, and while he led, or rather hauled Mademoiselle over the way, under the auspices of the Castilian, Rinaldo set the lover at liberty, made him a tender of his good offices, and advised him to wait at the public house for an happy issue of their negotiation. The pseudo-parson was very much affected by this generous proffer, for which he made suitable acknowledgments, and protested before God he would die 1,000 deaths rather than part with his dear Charlotte. Her father no sooner entered the apartment than he was known by Joshua to be a considerable trader in the city of London, and the merchant was glad to find himself among his acquaintance. He was so full of the story which had brought him thither that he had scarce sat down when he began to complain of his hard fate in having an only child who was so mean, stubborn, and contumacious, and every sentence was concluded with an apostrophe of reproaches to the delinquent. The Jew, having allowed him to ring out his alarm, condoled his misfortune, and gravely counseled the young lady to wean her affections from such an unworthy object, for he supposed her favorite was a man of no principle or liberal endowments, otherwise her father would not exclaim so bitterly against her conduct. Charlotte, who wanted neither beauty nor understanding, assured him that her lover's character was, in all respects, unblemished, for the truth of which assertion she appealed to her papa, who owned, with reluctance, that the young man was a gentleman by birth, that he had served him with remarkable diligence and integrity, and that his accomplishments were far superior to his station in life. But then, said he, the fellow has not a shilling of his own, and would you have me give away my daughter to a beggar? God forbid, cried the Jew, I always understood you possessed an ample fortune, and am sorry to find it otherwise. Otherwise, cried the citizen with some acrimony, take care what you say, sir. A merchant's credit is not to be tampered with. I beg your pardon, answered the Hebrew. I concluded that your circumstances were bad, because you objected to the poverty of the young man after you had owned he was possessed of every other qualification to make your daughter happy. For it is not to be imagined that you would thwart her inclinations, or seek to render an only child miserable on account of an obstacle which you yourself could easily remove. Let us suppose you can afford to give with your daughter £10,000, which would enable this young man to live with credit and reputation, and engage advantageously in trade, for which you say he is well qualified. The alternative then will be, whether you would rather see her in the arms of a deserving youth whom she loves, enjoying all the comforts of life with a moderate fortune, which it will always be in your own power to improve, or tied for life to a moneyed man whom she detests, cursing her hard fate, and despising that superfluity of wealth, in spite of which she finds herself so truly wretched. The old gentleman seemed to be startled at this observation, which was reinforced by Rinaldo's saying that he would, moreover, enjoy the unutterable pleasure of giving happiness to a worthy man, whose gratitude would cooperate with his love in approving himself a dutiful son as well as an affectionate husband. He then represented the family disquiets and dismal tragedies produced from such mercenary and compulsive matches, and, in conclusion, related the story of Don Diego and his daughter, which when the merchant heard, he started up with marks of terror in his countenance, and, throwing up the casement, called upon Valentine with great vociferation. This was the name of his daughter's admirer, who no sooner heard the summons than he flew to the spot from whence it came, and the merchant, without any further preamble, seizing his hand, joined it with that of Charlotte, saying with great trepidation, "Here, take her, in the name of God, and thank this honorable company for your good fortune." The lovers were transported with exquisite joy at this sudden determination in their favor. Valentine, having kissed the hand of his mistress with all the eagerness of rapture, and acknowledged the merchant's generosity, paid his respects to the ladies with a very polite address, and with demonstrations of uncommon gratitude and sensibility, thanked the gentleman, and the Count in particular, for their good offices, to which he attributed the happiness he now enjoyed. While Seraphina and Madame Clement caressed the amiable Charlotte, the rest of the company congratulated her admirer upon his choice and success, though the clergyman could not help reprehending him for profaning the sacerdotal habit. Valentine heartily asked pardon for having given such cause of offense, and hoped he should be forgiven, as it was a disguise which he thought absolutely necessary for the execution of a scheme upon which his happiness depended. He then, at the request of Rinaldo, unfolded the mystery of the hearse, by giving them to understand that Charlotte's father, having got inkling of their mutual passion, had dismissed his clerk, and conveyed his daughter to a country house in the neighborhood of London, in order to cut off their correspondence. Notwithstanding these precautions, they had found means to communicate with each other by letters, which were managed by a third person. And his rival being very importunate in his solicitations, they had concerted the expedient of the hearse, which he provided and conducted through a road contiguous to the end of the merchant's garden, where Charlotte, being apprised of the design, waited for its approach, and embarked in it without hesitation. Valentine thought himself sufficiently screened from discovery by his disguise, but he was unfortunately met by a servant of the family, who recollected his features, and immediately gave the alarm, upon which the father and his friends took horse, and pursued them by 2 different roads, until they were overtaken at this place. He had scarce finished this short relation, when his rival, bluntly entering the apartment, with an handkerchief tied round his eye, committed Valentine to the charge of a constable, who attended him, by a warrant from a justice of the peace in that neighborhood, and threatened to prosecute the merchant on an action of damages for the loss of an eye, which he said he had sustained in his service. The company endeavored to appease this citizen, by representing that his misfortune was no other than a common inflammation, nor was it owing to malice aforethought, but entirely to the precipitate passion of an incensed young man, who, by the by, acted in his own defense. At the same time, the merchant promised to make any reasonable satisfaction, upon which the other demanded an obligation, importing that he would, in 10 days from the date, bestow upon him his daughter in marriage, with a portion of £15,000, or, in case of failure, pay him double the sum. The merchant, exasperated at this extravagant demand, told him flatly he had already disposed of his daughter to Valentine, who, he believed, was a much more deserving man, and that he was ready to wait upon the magistrate who had granted the warrant, in order to give bail for his future son-in-law. This was a mortifying declaration to the plaintiff, though he condoled himself with the hope of being a gainer by the loss of his eye, and now the pain was over would have been very sorry to find his sight retrieved. The old gentleman, Joshua, and Rinaldo accompanied the prisoner to the house of the justice, where he was immediately admitted to bail. Upon their return, Valentine shifted his dress, and they supped together with great cordiality and mirth, maintained at the expense of the discarded lover. After supper, Don Diego walked a minuet with Madame Clement, for whom, by this time, he had contracted an extraordinary degree of affection. Valentine had the honor to dance with the incomparable Seraphina, whose beauty and attractions dazzled the eyes of the newcomers and struck her bashful partner with awe and confusion. And Melville presented his hand to the agreeable Charlotte, who performed so much to the satisfaction of her father that he could not help expressing his joy and pride. He praised God for throwing him in the way of our company, and engaged the clergyman to unite the young couple, after having appointed a day for the ceremony and invited all present to the wedding. The evening having been insensibly consumed in these avocations, and the night pretty far advanced, the ladies withdrew without ceremony, and the retreat of Seraphina filled Rinaldo's breast with tumult and emotion. His blood began to flow in impetuous tides, his heart to beat with redoubled vigor and velocity, while his eyes seemed to flash with more than human splendor. Now his imagination began to anticipate with the enthusiastic rage of an inspired Sibyl. He was instantaneously transported from the conversation, and every nerve was braced to such a degree of impatience that human nature could not long endure the tension. He, therefore, having withstood the impulse about a quarter of an hour, at length gave way to his impetuosity, and, springing from his friends, found himself in a dark passage, at the farther end of which he perceived Madame Clement coming out of a chamber with a light, which, at sight of him, she set down and vanished in a moment. This was the star that pointed to his paradise. He hailed the signal, entered the apartment, and like a lion rushing on his prey, approached the nuptial bed, where Seraphina, surrounded by all the graces of beauty, softness, sentiment, and truth, lay trembling as a victim at the altar, and strove to hide her blushes from his view. The door was shut, the light extinguished. He owned his lot was more than mortal man could claim. Here let me draw the decent veil that ought to shade the secret mysteries of Hymen. Away, unhallowed scoffers, who profane, with idle pleasantry or immodest hint, these holy rites, and leave those happy lovers to enjoy, in one another's arms, unutterable bliss, the well-earned palm of virtue and of constancy, which had undergone the most severe refinement. A more deserving pair night's curtain shrouds not in its dark extent. The thoughts of Rinaldo's felicity threw a damp on the spirits of Valentine, who saw the term of his probation protracted a few days longer, and could not help wishing in his heart that he had achieved the adventure which would have abridged his expectation, though at the expense of the old gentleman's displeasure. He filled a bumper to the health of the bride and bridegroom, and throwing up his eyes with marks of admiration, exclaimed, "How happy is the Count! Alas! 5 days longer must I rein my impatience. It is but reasonable, you rogue, that your betters should have the start of you," said the merchant, who did him justice in the glass, and counseled him to drown his impatience with good claret. The youth followed his advice, and it was late before the company retired to rest. These citizens, however, resolved to seize an opportunity of rallying the new-married couple, according to custom, and with that view arose early in the morning, on the supposition of finding them still asleep. But they were not a little surprised, when they entered the breakfasting room, to see Rinaldo and his amiable bedfellow, already dressed, and awaiting to do the honors of the house. The old gentleman would fain have cracked a joke upon their extraordinary dispatch, but he was so much overawed by the dignity and tamed by the sweetness of Seraphina's carriage that he durst not give utterance to his conception, and Valentine stood silent and abashed, as in the presence of a superior being. After breakfast, these gentlemen and Charlotte again expressed their sense of the obligations they owed to this happy family, repeated their invitation, and, taking leave, returned to London in a coach that was provided overnight. Our friends being thus left to themselves, Don Diego turned towards Melville. "Now," said he, "that I have yielded to the impatience of your love, as well as to the eagerness of my own desire to make you happy, I must beg leave to interrupt, for a little while, the stream of your mutual pleasure, and propose a melancholy excursion, which, however, will not be wholly void of enjoyment. I have too long delayed the performance of my duty at Antonia's grave. Let us spend the forenoon in that pious pilgrimage. I will drop a few tears to the memory of that excellent woman, and never afterwards shall my friends be troubled with my grief." The proposal being universally approved, they set out for the place, which had oft been visited by the gentle Seraphina, who conducted her father to a black marble stone, which Rinaldo had ordered to be laid over the grave. And, as he kneeled to kiss the monument, he perceived this plain inscription in the Spanish tongue. Antonia de Zelos, primer en tedulo que e ser bueno, y sin segundo en tedulo que fu ser destachado, qued con Dios. That is, Antonia de Zelos, unmatched in virtue and unequaled in misfortune, adieu. O faithful record, cried the Castilian, smiting his breast, while his tears distilled upon the marble. Thy goodness was the gift of heaven, but thy misfortunes were derived from the guilt of Don Diego. Yet his sorrow shall expiate his offense, and his penitence find favor in the sight of heaven. Rest, rest, ill-fated virtue. Eternal peace shall guard thy tomb, and angels minister to thy unspotted shade. Nor shall thine ashes lie in dark obscurity. Here will I raise a monument, more suited to thy excellence and name. Seraphina melted with filial tenderness, nor were the rest unmoved at this affecting scene, which Don Diego did not quit without reluctance. Chapter 67. The longest and the last. The nature of this visit had softened every heart and saddened every countenance, and they walked in solemn silence to the other side of the churchyard in order to regain their carriages. When, at the turning of the stile, they saw a young woman, in wretched attire, running out of a poor habitation, wringing her hands in all the agony of despair. Notwithstanding the distraction in her countenance and the meanness of her apparel, she discovered a regularity of features and a delicacy of air, which did not at all correspond with the misery of her equipage. These exhibitions of extreme distress soon attracted the notice and compassion of our company, and Melville's beauteous helpmate, accosting this forlorn damsel with a pity-breathing aspect, asked the cause of her disorder. "Alas, dear lady," cried the other with all the emphasis of woe, "an unhappy gentleman now breathes his last within this inhospitable hovel, amidst such excess of misery as would melt the most flinty bosom. What then must I feel, who am connected with him by the strongest ties of love and conjugal affection?" "Who is the unfortunate object?" said the physician. "He was once well known in the gay world," replied the young woman. "His name is Fathom." Every individual of the company started at mention of that detested name. Seraphina began to tremble with emotion, and Rinaldo, after a short pause, declared he would go in, not with a view to exult over his misery, but in order to contemplate the catastrophe of such a wicked life, that the moral might be the more deeply engraved on his remembrance. The young countess, whose tender heart could not bear the shock of such a spectacle, retired to the coach with Madame Clement and the Jew, while Rinaldo, accompanied by the rest, entered a dismal apartment altogether void of furniture and convenience, where they beheld the wretched hero of these memoirs stretched almost naked upon straw, insensible, convulsed, and seemingly in the grasp of death. He was worn to the bone either by famine or distemper. His face was overshadowed with hair and filth. His eyes were sunk, glazed, and distorted, his nostrils dilated, his lips covered with a black slough, and his complexion faded into a pale clay color tending to a yellow hue. In a word, the extremity of indigence, squalor, and distress could not be more feelingly represented. While Melville perused this melancholy lesson, and groaning, cried, "Behold the fate of man!" He perceived a letter in the right hand of the unfortunate Fathom, which lay fast clenched across his breast. Curious to know the contents of this paper, which the young woman said he had kept in that position for several days, he drew nearer the wretched couch, and was not a little surprised to see it addressed to the Right Honourable Rinaldo Count de Melville, to the care of Mr. Joshua Manasseh, merchant in London. When he attempted to disengage this billet from the author's hand, the sorrowing female fell upon her knees, entreating him to desist, and telling him she had promised, upon oath, to communicate the contents to no person upon earth, but to carry the letter, upon her husband's decease, to the gentleman to whose care it was directed. Rinaldo assured her, upon his honor, that he was the very Rinaldo Count de Melville, for whom it was intended, and the young creature was so much confounded at this information, that, before she could recollect herself, Melville had opened the billet, and read these words: "If this paper should fall into the hands of the noble Rinaldo, he will understand that Fathom was the most execrable traitor that ever imposed upon unsuspecting benevolence or attempted to betray a generous benefactor. His whole life was a series of fraud, perfidy, and the most abominable ingratitude. But of all the crimes that lay heavy upon his soul, his being accessory to the death of the incomparable Seraphina, whose father he had also robbed, was that for which he despaired of heaven's forgiveness, notwithstanding the dreadful compunction and remorse which have long preyed upon his heart, together with the incredible misery and deplorable death which by this time he hath undergone. Though these sufferings and sorrows cannot atone for his enormous guilt, perhaps they will excite the compassion of the humane Count de Melville. At least, this confession, which my conscience dictates under all the terrors of death and futurity, may be a warning for him to avoid henceforth a smiling villain, like the execrable Fathom, upon whose miserable soul Almighty God have mercy." Rinaldo was deeply affected with the contents of this scroll, which denoted such horror and despair. He saw there could be no dissimulation or sinister design in this profession of penitence. He beheld the condition of the writer, which put all his humane passions in commotion, so that he remembered nothing of Fathom but his present distress. He could scarce maintain those indications which might have been justly deemed the effect of weakness and infirmity. And having desired the physician and clergyman to contribute their assistance for the benefit of that wretch's soul and body, he ran to the coach, and communicated the letter to the ladies, at the same time drawing a picture of the object he had seen, which brought tears into the eyes of the gentle Seraphina, who earnestly entreated her lord to use his endeavors for the relief and recovery of the unhappy man, that he might, if possible, live to enjoy the benefit of mature repentance, and not die in that dreadful despair which he manifested in the letter. Rinaldo, returning to the house, found the pious clergyman reading prayers with great fervency, while Don Diego stood with his right hand upon his breast, looking steadfastly upon the agonizing Fathom, and the young woman kneeled, with her streaming eyes lifted up to heaven, in an ecstasy of grief and devotion. The physician had run to an apothecary's shop in the neighborhood, from whence he soon returned with an assistant, who applied a large blister to the back of the miserable patient, while the female, by the doctor's direction, moistened his mouth with a cordial which he had prescribed. These charitable steps being taken, Count de Melville entreated the apothecary's servant to procure a tent bed for the accommodation of the sick person with all imaginable dispatch. And in less than an hour, one was actually pitched, and Fathom lifted into it, after he had been shifted, and in some measure purified from the dregs of his indigence. During this transaction, the ladies were conducted to a tavern not far off, where dinner was bespoke, that they might be at hand to see the effect of their charity, which was not confined to what we have already described, but extended so far that, in a little time, the apartment was comfortably furnished, and the young creature provided with change of apparel and money to procure the necessaries of subsistence. Notwithstanding all their care, the wretched Fathom still remained insensible, and the doctor pronounced a very unfavorable prognostic, while he ordered a pair of additional vesicatories to be laid upon his arms and other proper medicines to be administered. After dinner, the ladies ventured to visit the place, and when Seraphina crossed the threshold, the weeping female fell at her feet, and, kissing her robe, exclaimed, "Sure you are an angel from heaven." The alteration in her dress had made a very agreeable change in her appearance, so that the Countess could now look upon her without shuddering at her distress. And, As Fathom was not in a condition to be disturbed, she took this opportunity of inquiring by what steps that unfortunate wretch was conveyed from the prison, in which she knew he had been confined, to the place where he now lay in such extremity, and by what occurrence he had found a wife in such an abyss of misfortune. Here the other's tears began to flow afresh. "I am ashamed," said she, "to reveal my own folly, yet I dare not refuse a satisfaction of this kind to a person who has laid me under such signal obligations." She then proceeded to relate her story, by which it appeared she was no other than the fair and unhappy Eleanor, whom the artful Fathom had debauched upon his first arrival in town, in the manner already described in these memoirs. "Heaven," continued she, "was pleased to restore the use of my reason, which I had lost when I found myself abandoned by the Count. But all my connection with my own family being entirely cut off, and every door shut against a poor creature who could procure no recommendation, except the certificate signed by the physician of Bedlam, which, instead of introducing me to service, was an insurmountable objection to my character, I found myself destitute of all means of subsisting, unless I would condescend to live the infamous and wretched life of a courtesan, an expedient rendered palatable by the terrors of want. Cooperating with the reflection of the irretrievable loss I had already sustained, I ask pardon for offending your chaste ears with this impure confession of my guilt, which, heaven knows, I then did, and now do look upon with abhorrence and detestation. I had already forfeited my innocence, and wanted resolution to encounter misery and death. Nevertheless, before I could determine to embrace the condition of a prostitute, I was one day accosted in the park by an elderly gentleman who sat down by me upon a bench, and, taking notice of the despondence which was evident in my countenance, pressed me to make him acquainted with the nature of my misfortune. So much sympathy and good sense appeared in his deportment and conversation, that I gratified his request, and he, in return for my confidence, saved me from the most horrible part of my prospect, by taking me into his protection and reserving me for his own appetite. In this situation I lived a whole year, until I was deprived of my keeper by an apoplectic fit, and turned out of doors by his relations, who did not, however, strip me of the clothes and movables which I owed to his bounty. Far from being as yet reconciled to a vicious life, I resolved to renounce the paths of shame, and, converting my effects into ready money, hired a small shop, and furnished it with haberdashery ware, intending to earn an honest livelihood by the sale of these commodities, together with the plain work in which I hoped to be employed so soon as my talents should be known. But this scheme did not answer my expectation. The goods spoiled upon my hands, and as I was a stranger in the neighborhood, nobody would entrust me with any other business. So that, notwithstanding the most parsimonious economy, I ran in debt to my landlord, who seized my effects, and an hosier from whom I had received some parcels upon credit took out a writ against me, by virtue of which I was arrested and imprisoned in the Marshalsea, where I found my first seducer. Good heaven! What did I feel at this unexpected meeting, overwhelmed as I was before with my own distress? I with a loud scream fainted away, and when I recovered, found myself in the arms of Mr. Fathom, who wept over me with great affliction. All his prospects of gaiety had now vanished, and his heart was softened by his own misfortunes, to a feeling of another's woe, as well as to a due sense of his own guilt. He expressed the deepest sorrow for having been the occasion of my ruin, endeavored to comfort me with a promise of assistance, and indeed, by practicing medicine among the prisoners, made shift to keep us both from starving. But surely no sinner underwent such severe remorse as that which he suffered during his imprisonment. From the day of our meeting, I never once saw him smile. A melancholy cloud continually overhung his countenance. He numbered the minutes by his groans. He used to start with horror from his sleep, and striking his breast would exclaim, "O Eleanor, I am the worst of villains." Sometimes he seemed disordered in his brain, and raved about Rinaldo and Monimia. In a word, his mind was in a dreadful situation, and all his agonies were communicated to me, whom by this time he had married, in order to make some atonement for my wrongs. Wretched as he then was, I remembered the accomplished youth who had captivated my virgin heart. The old impressions still remained. I saw his penitence, pitied his misfortune, and his wife being dead, consented to join his fate, the ceremony having been performed by a fellow prisoner who was in orders. Though his hard-hearted creditor had no other chance of being paid than that of setting him at liberty, he lent a deaf ear to all our supplications, and this cruelty conspiring with the anguish of my husband's own reflection affected his health and spirits to such a degree that he could no longer earn the miserable pittance which had hitherto supported our lives. Then our calamities began to multiply. Indigence and famine stared us in the face, and it was with the utmost difficulty that we resisted their attacks by selling or pledging our wearing apparel until we were left almost quite naked, when we found ourselves discharged by an act passed for the relief of insolvent debtors. This charitable law, which was intended for a consolation to the wretched, proved to us the most severe disaster, for we were turned out into the streets, utterly destitute of food, raiment, and lodging, at a time when Mr. Fathom was so weakened by his distemper that he could not stand alone. I supported him from door to door, imploring the compassion of charitable Christians, and was at length permitted to shelter him in this miserable place, where his disease gaining ground, he lay 3 days in that deplorable condition, from which he hath now been rescued, though I fear too late, by your humanity and benevolence. She shed a flood of tears at the conclusion of this mournful tale, which did not fail to affect the whole audience, especially Seraphina, who assured her that, whatever should happen to her husband, she might depend upon finding favor and protection, provided her conduct should correspond with her professions. While this grateful creature kissed the hand of her kind benefactress, Fathom uttered a groan, began to stir in the bed, and with a languid voice called upon a Leonard, who, instantly withdrawing the curtain, presented the whole company to his view. He had now retrieved the use of his perception by the operation of the blisters, which began to torture him severely. He looked around him with amazement and affright, and distinguishing the 3 persons against whom the chief arrows of his fraud and treachery had been leveled, he concluded that he was now arrived at the land of departed souls, and that the shades of those whom he had so grievously injured were come to see him tormented according to his demerits. Fraught with this notion, which was confirmed by the bodily pain which he felt, and the appearance of the clergyman and Joshua, whom he mistook for the ministers of vengeance, he cried in a tone replete with horror, "Is there no mercy then for penitents? Is there no pity due to the miseries I suffered upon earth? Save me, O bountiful heaven, from the terrors of everlasting woe, hide me from these dreadful executioners, whose looks are torture. Forgive me, generous Castilian, O Rinaldo. Thou hadst once a tender heart. I dare not lift my eyes to Seraphina, that pattern of human excellence, who fell a victim to my atrocious guilt, yet her aspect is all mildness and compassion. Ha, are not these the drops of pity? Yes, they are the tears of mercy. They fall like refreshing showers upon my drooping soul. Ah, murdered innocence, wilt thou not intercede for thy betrayer at the throne of grace?" Here he was interrupted by Melville, who with a grave and solemn air pronounced, "Great hath been thy guilt, unhappy Ferdinand, and great have been thy sufferings. Yet we come not to insult, but to alleviate thy distress. Providence hath kindly defeated thy dire intentions, which we therefore now forgive and transmit to oblivion, whether it be thy lot to yield up thy spirit immediately, or to survive the dangerous malady with which thou art at present overwhelmed. Suffer not thyself to despair, for the mercy of heaven is infinite, and submit to the directions of this worthy gentleman, who will employ his skill for thy recovery, while we shall take care to furnish thee with necessary attendance. As too much speaking may be prejudicial to thy health, I dispense with thy reply, and exhort thee to compose thyself to rest." So saying, he drew the curtain, and the company retired, leaving Fathom entranced with wonder. The next step which Rinaldo took for the benefit of this wretched penitent was to send for the apothecary, with whom he left a sum of money to be expended for the convenience of Fathom and his wife. Then he laid injunctions upon the physician to repeat his visits, and that gentleman, together with the clergyman and Joshua, taking leave of the others till next day, the Count set out with the ladies and his father-in-law to the house where they had lodged the preceding night. The reader may well imagine the conversation of the evening turned wholly upon the strange occurrence of the day, which seemed to have been concerted by supernatural prescience, in order to satisfy the vengeance, and afford matter of triumph to the generosity of those who had been so grievously injured by the guilty Fathom. Though not one of them would say that such a miscreant ought to live, Yet all concurred in approving the offices of humanity which had been performed, and even endeavored to find specious pretext for vindicating their compassion. Don Diego said, "It would ill become a transgressor like him to withhold his forgiveness from a sinner who had wronged him." Madame Clement appealed to the approbation of heaven, which had undoubtedly directed them that way, for the purpose they had fulfilled. Seraphina observed that the crimes of the delinquent were obliterated by his sorrow, misery, and repentance. Rinaldo honestly owned that, exclusive of other reasons, he could not deny himself the luxurious enjoyment of communicating happiness to his fellow creatures in distress, and each fervently prayed that their charity might not be disappointed by the death of the object. While they amused themselves in these discussions, Fathom, after having lain some hours silent, in consequence of Rinaldo's advice, could no longer suppress the astonishment of his mind, but addressing himself to his wife, "O Eleanor," said he, "my delirium is now past, though I still remember the fantasies of my distempered brain. Among other reveries, my imagination was regaled with a vision so perfect and distinct as to emulate truth and reality. Methought Count de Melville, Don Diego de Zelos, and the divine Seraphina, the very persons who are now crying before the throne of heaven for vengeance against the guilty Fathom, stood by my bedside, with looks of pity and forgiveness, and that Rinaldo spoke peace to my despairing soul. I heard the words distinctly. I retain them in my memory. I saw the tears trickle from Seraphina's eyes. I heard her father utter a compassionate sigh, and should actually believe that they were personally present, had not I long ago seen with my own eyes the funeral procession of that young lady, whose wrongs God pardon, and were I not convinced that such a meeting could not be effected without the immediate and miraculous interposition of heaven. Yet everything I now see corresponds with the words of Rinaldo, which still sound in my ears. When my perception forsook me, I lay in the most abject misery, among straw, and thou, poor injured innocence, wast naked and forlorn. Now, I find myself reposed in a warm, easy, comfortable bed. I see around me the marks of human charity and care, and the favorable change in thy appearance glads my poor dejected heart. Say, whence this happy alteration? Do I really awake from that dream of misery in which we have continued so long? Or do I still utter the extravagant ravings of a distempered brain? Eleanor was afraid of imparting at once all the particulars of the happy change he had undergone, lest they might leave a dangerous impression upon his fancy, which was not yet duly composed. She contented herself, therefore, with telling him that he had been obliged to the humanity of a gentleman and lady, who chanced to pass that way by accident, and who, understanding his deplorable case, had furnished him with the conveniences which he now enjoyed. She then presented to him what the doctor had directed her to administer, and, admonishing him to commit his head to the pillow, he was favored with a breathing sweat, fell fast asleep, and in a few hours waked again altogether cool and undisturbed. It was upon this occasion that his wife explained the circumstances of that visit which had redeemed him from extremity of wretchedness and the jaws of death, upon which he started up, and throwing himself upon his knees, exclaimed, "All gracious power, this was the work of thy own bounteous hand. The voice of my sorrow and repentance hath been heard. Thou hast inspired my benefactors with more than mortal goodness in my behalf. How shall I praise thy name? How shall I requite their generosity? Oh, I am bankrupt to both. Yet let me not perish until I shall have convinced them of my reformation, and seen them enjoying that felicity which ought to be reserved for such consummate virtue." Next day, in the forenoon, he was visited by the physician, whom he now recollected to have seen at the house of Madame Clement, and, after having thanked that gentleman for his humanity and care, he earnestly begged to know by what means Seraphina had been preserved. When he was satisfied in this particular, and given to understand that she was now happy in the arms of Rinaldo, "Blessed be God," he cried, "for having defeated the villainy of him who sought to part such lovers. Dear sir, will you add one circumstance to your charity, and bear to that happy couple, and the noble Don Diego, the respects and the remorse of a sincere penitent, whom their compassion hath raised to life? I have been such a traitor to them, that my words deserve no regard. I will not therefore use professions. I dare not hope to be admitted into their presence. I am indeed ashamed to see the light of the sun. How then could I bear the looks of that injured family? Ah, no. Let me hide myself in some obscure retreat, where I may work out my salvation with fear and trembling, and pray incessantly to heaven for their prosperity. The physician promised to represent his contrition to the count and his lady, and accordingly proceeded to their habitation, where he repeated these expressions and pronounced his patient out of danger. So that their thoughts were now employed in concerting a scheme for his future subsistence, that he might not be exposed by indigence to a relapse in point of morals. Rinaldo being still averse to any personal intercourse with such a wretch, until he should give some undoubted proofs of amendment, and, as yet afraid of entrusting him with any office that required integrity, resolved, with the approbation of all present, to settle him in a cheap county in the north of England, where he and his wife could live comfortably on an annuity of £60, until his behavior should entitle him to a better provision. This resolution was just taken, when Joshua arrived with a gentleman whom he introduced to Don Diego as the secretary of the Spanish ambassador. After the first compliments, the stranger told the Castilian that he waited upon him at the desire of his excellency, who would have come in person had he not been confined by the gout. Then he put into his hand a letter from the court of Madrid, written by a nobleman of Diego's acquaintance, who informed him that Don Manuel de Mendoza, having made away with himself by poison, in order to avoid the disgrace of a legal conviction, His Catholic Majesty was now convinced of Don Diego's innocence, and granted him leave to return and take possession of his honors and estate. This information was confirmed by the secretary, who assured him that the ambassador had orders to make him acquainted with this favorable decision of the king. The Castilian, having first acquitted himself in the most polite terms to the secretary and the Jew, who, he said, had always been a messenger of glad tidings, communicated his happiness to the company, and this evening concluded the third day of their rejoicing. Next morning Don Diego went to visit the ambassador, accompanied by Joshua and the secretary, while the physician, repairing to the habitation of Fathom, signified, by Rinaldo's direction, the resolution which had been taken in his behalf. And the patient no sooner heard his doom than, lifting up his hands, he cried, "I am unworthy of such tenderness and benevolence." While Eleanor shed a flood of tears in silence, unable to give utterance to her grateful thought, Melville's bounty having so far transcended her most sanguine hope. The Spaniard, having paid his devoirs to his excellency, returned before dinner, and in the afternoon, desiring a private conference with Seraphina, they retired into another apartment, and he expressed himself to this effect: "You have contracted, my dear child, an habit of calling Madame Clement your mother, and doubtless, by her maternal tenderness and regard, she hath acquired a just title to the appellation. Yet I own I would fain strengthen it by a legal claim. I no sooner retrieved my daughter than I gave her away to the most deserving youth that ever sighed with love. I rejoice in the gift which secured your happiness, but I left myself in a solitary situation, which even the return of my good fortune cannot render easy and supportable. When I revisit the castle of Zelos, every well-known object will recall the memory of my Antonia, and I shall want a companion to fill her place, and to sympathize with me in that sorrow which will be derived from my remembrance. Who is there so worthy to succeed your mother in the affection of Don Diego, as she who interests her love for Seraphina, and resembles her so strongly in every virtue of the sex? Similar attractions will produce similar effects. My heart is already attached to that good lady, and, provided Seraphina shall approve of my choice, I will lay myself and fortune at her feet." The fair countess replied, with an enchanting smile, that, before this declaration, she had with pleasure perceived the progress which Madame Clement had made in his heart, and that she did not believe there was a person upon earth better qualified to repair the loss he had sustained, though she foresaw one obstacle to his happiness, which she was afraid would not be easily surmounted. "You mean," answered the Castilian, "the difference of religion, which I am resolved to remove by adopting the Protestant faith, though I am fully satisfied that real goodness is of no particular persuasion, and that salvation cannot depend upon belief, over which the will has no influence. I invest you, therefore, with the charge of declaring my passion and proposal, and empower you to satisfy her scruples with regard to the religion which I now profess, and which I shall not openly relinquish, until I shall have secured, in this country, effects sufficient to screen me from the ill consequences of my king's displeasure." Seraphina undertook this office with pleasure, because she had reason to think his addresses would not be disagreeable to Madame Clement, and that same night made the Count acquainted with the nature of her commission. Nor was her expectation disappointed. The French lady, with that frankness which is peculiar to virtue and good breeding, confessed that Don Diego was not indifferent to her choice, and did not hesitate in receiving him upon the footing of a lover. As we have already dwelt circumstantially on the passion of love, so as perhaps even to have tired our readers, we shall not repeat the dialogue that passed, when the Spaniard was indulged with an opportunity to explain his sentiments. Suffice it to observe that the lady's days of coquetry were now over, and that she was too wise to trifle with the time, which every moment became more and more precious. It was agreed, then, that Don Diego should settle his affairs in Spain and return to England in order to espouse Madame Clement, with a view to fix his residence in this island, where Rinaldo likewise proposed to enjoy the sweets of his fortune, provided he could draw hither his interests and connections. Meanwhile, having for some days enjoyed his bliss with all the fullness of rapture amidst this small but agreeable society, he shifted the scene, and conducted his dear partner to a ready-furnished house in town, which, together with an occasional equipage, his friend Joshua had hired for the accommodation of him and his father-in-law, who, during his stay in England, failed not to cultivate the mistress of his heart with the most punctual assiduity. Hitherto Seraphina had been as a precious jewel locked up in a casket, which the owner alone had an opportunity to contemplate. But now the Count, who was proud of such a prize, resolved to let her shine forth to the admiration of the whole world. With this view, he bespoke such ornaments as befitted her quality, and, while the mantua-makers were employed in her service, made a tour among his former acquaintance, and discharged the obligations under which he lay to some who had assisted him in his distress. He did not, however, introduce them to his charming Seraphina, because not one of them had formerly treated her with that delicacy of regard which he thought her due. And some of them were much mortified at their neglect, when they saw what a dazzling figure she made in the beau monde. She was visited by the Spanish and imperial ambassadors, and divers other foreigners of distinction, to whom Melville had letters of recommendation. But her first public appearance was in a box at the opera, accompanied by Madame Clement, the Count, and Don Diego. The entertainment was already begun, so that her entrance had the greater effect upon the audience, whose attention was soon detached from the performance and riveted upon this amiable apparition, which seemed to be some bright being of another world dropped from the clouds among them. Then did the spirit of curiosity play its part. 1,000 whispers circulated, as many glasses were exalted to reconnoiter this box of foreigners, for such they concluded them to be from their appearance. Every male spectator acknowledged Seraphina to be the paragon of beauty, and every female confessed that Melville was the model of a fine gentleman. The charms of the young countess did not escape the eye and approbation of royalty itself, and when her rank was known, from the information of the ambassadors and other people of condition who were seen saluting her at a distance, that same evening 1,000 bumpers were swallowed in honor of the Countess de Melville. The fame of her beauty was immediately extended over this immense metropolis, and different schemes were concerted for bringing her into life. These, however, she resisted with unwearied obstinacy. Her happiness centered in Rinaldo and the cultivation of a few friends within the shade of domestic quiet. She did not even forget the concerns of the wretched Fathom and his faithful Eleanor, who daily enjoyed fresh instances of her humanity and care. When his fever forsook him, he was supplied with nourishing food for the recovery of his health, and as soon as he found himself in a condition to travel, he gave notice to his benefactor, who desired Joshua to settle with him the manner in which he was to receive his allowance and to pay the first half-year's salary per advance. This affair being adjusted, and the place of his retreat signified, the Jew told Eleanor that she might wait upon the Countess before their departure, and she did not fail to make use of this permission. After they had made the necessary preparations for their journey and taken places in the York stagecoach, Mrs. Fathom, clothing herself in decent apparel, went to the house of Count Melville and was immediately admitted to the presence of Seraphina, who received her with her usual complacency, enriched her with salutary advice, comforted her with the hope of better things, provided her conduct and that of her husband should henceforth be found irreproachable, and, wishing her peace and happiness, presented her with a box of linen and 20 guineas in a purse. Such excessive goodness overpowered this sensible young woman to such a degree that she stood before her in speechless awe and veneration. And the Countess, in order to relieve her from the confusion under which she suffered, quitted the room, leaving her to the care of her woman. It was not long, however, before her gratitude broke out in loud exclamations and a violent passion of tears, which all her efforts could not, for a while, overcome. By this time the coach was brought up to the gate for the reception of Seraphina, who took an airing every day at the same hour. When Rinaldo, leading her to the vehicle, beheld a man plainly dressed standing within the court, with his head and body bent towards the earth, so that his countenance could not be perceived. Melville, who supposed him to be some unfortunate man come to implore his charity, turned towards him and asked with a humane accent if he wanted to speak with any person in the house. To this interrogation the stranger replied, without lifting up his head, "Overwhelmed as I am with Count Melville's generosity, together with a consciousness of my own unworthiness, it ill becomes a wretch like me to importune him for further favor. Yet I could not bear the thought of withdrawing, perhaps forever, from the presence of my benefactor, without soliciting his permission to see his face in mercy, to acknowledge my atrocious crimes, to hear my pardon confirmed by his voice, and that of his accomplished countess, whom I dare not even at a distance behold, and to express my fervent wish for their prosperity." Melville, whose heart was but too tender, could not hear this address without emotion. He recognized the companion of his infancy and youth. He remembered the happy scenes he had enjoyed with Fathom, whose voice had always such an effect upon his ear as to excite the ideas of friendship and esteem. And he was disturbed by this unexpected meeting, which also discomposed the beauteous Seraphina. Rinaldo having paused a little, "It is with pain," said he, "I recollect anything to the prejudice of Fathom, whose future behavior will, I hope, erase the memory of his offenses and justify what other steps I may take in his favor. Meanwhile, I heartily forgive what is past, and in token of my sincerity, present my hand," which our adventurer bathed with his tears. The Countess, whose mind was in unison with her husband, repeated her assurances of pardon and protection, at which the penitent rejoiced in silence, while he raised his head and took a parting view of those charms which had formerly enslaved his heart. Having thus obeyed the dictates of his duty and inclination, he next morning embarked in the stagecoach, with his faithful Eleanor, and in 6 days arrived at the place of his retreat, which he found extremely well adapted to the circumstances of his mind and fortune. For all his vice and ambition was now quite mortified within him, and his whole attention engrossed in atoning for his former crimes by a sober and penitent life, by which alone he could deserve the uncommon generosity of his patrons. While he thus accommodated himself to his new system, Rinaldo received letters of congratulation from his sister, who with the major had come to Brussels in order to meet her brother and Seraphina, according to his proposal. This intimation being communicated to Don Diego, he resolved to accompany them to Flanders, on his way to Spain. Preparations were made for their departure. The clergyman and physician were honored with valuable marks of friendship and esteem from the Countess, Rinaldo, and the Castilian, who were convoyed to Deal by Madame Clement, to whom, at parting, Don Diego presented a diamond ring as a pledge of his inviolable love. Here the travelers hired a vessel for Ostend, which they reached in a few hours. In 2 days more they arrived at Brussels, where Mrs. Farrell and her husband were struck with admiration at the surprising beauty and accomplishment of their sister-in-law, whom they caressed with equal tenderness and joy. In a word, all parties were as happy as good fortune could make them, and Don Diego set out for Spain after they had agreed to reside in the Low Countries till his return. The end.